almost every day I get a new case from somewhere in the world. And it takes a while at times to get the information through, and many times I can't even get the information because of obstructions in that process. Our government doesn't want to give up that information. And even though we have the Freedom of Information Act and it's supposed to be that free release of information upon request, it doesn't happen like that. And I got notified by the Park Service that they were going to give me this commercial requester tag. And what that means is that they're going to charge me, I think, $65 an hour for every request and all time that is committed to them. And I put that out on my Facebook and on my Twitter account, and some good souls came forward and said, hey, we'll do it for you. And so that's the way I've gotten around it. I've used people, listeners, that have gotten to me and said, hey, we'll help you do that. You know, we'll request and we'll just give you the information when we get it. And that has helped. It's definitely an obstructive process. I held a conference, and John Greenwald from the Black Vault was there. His site contains some of the most comprehensive lists of Freedom of Information Acts I've ever seen. And I even went through it all with him to make sure I'm hitting all the stones, doing it right. And John just said, Dave, I can't believe that you're faced with this. This is unreal. He goes, first of all, to be a commercial requester, you have a website, you've done a movie, you have books and libraries. He goes, that should not be a tag they can put on you. And I've even had attorneys contact me and said, hey, you know, what can we do pro bono to try to help with the cause? And that's never even helped. So I really thought that maybe with a turn in the Park Service, they get a new leader. I thought that would change. Well, 3 months ago, I sent Zinke a letter outlining what they wanted to charge me 3 years ago, $34,000 for a list of people from Yosemite and $1.4 million for a list of people from their entire system. And I said, hopefully the tide has changed and you understand that I'm trying to do a good thing here for the people and for the victims' families, and I would hope that at this point you could get the information for me and we could work on this together. He never even responded.
Let's talk a little bit about how you are selective about which cases go in.
I use a vetting out process at the beginning to ensure that we keep consistent, mainly if the disappearance is voluntary, meaning the person told his family, hey, I just want to drop out of society, I don't want to be involved with this anymore, I'm just going to take off. Or maybe it was a suicide. And any type of suicidal or mental health issues, we'll vet those out. And any type of criminal element, any type of evidence that there was a crime in conjunction with the disappearance, we'll vet that out. And then the last one is predation. Any type of animal predation at the scene, in the area, any type of thoughts that the search and rescue or law enforcement had that this person was maybe drug off and buried by a bear, cached by a bear, etc., it'll vet those out. So what we're left with is cases where canines come to the scene, they can't find a scent, or they don't want to track. And that's a tough thing to determine from the handler. Sometimes they'll walk in a circle and they'll lay down. Sometimes they'll walk up the trail 15 feet and turn around and come back. But there's a lot of cases out there where the person is not found by canines. And that's criteria number one. Number two is they bring in FLIR. And FLIR is forward-looking infrared radar in helicopters. They'll fly the area and they'll look for a heat signature from a body or from a live person. Or sometimes they'll even see a bear in the area moving through. And if there's no heat signature, there's no FLIR reading, that would be another big reading, another big point on our profile. And then boulder fields. A lot of times people go missing in or around a boulder field, or they are found in a boulder field. And I know that sounds odd, but the number of times this happens is phenomenal. Another one is that the victims travel long distances or get to phenomenal heights. Meaning, say, a 2-year-old disappears, and the grids set down by search and rescue professionals in their books state that a 2-year-old should be found 95% of the time in 2 miles or less from the point they were last seen. Well, I have a lot of cases where these kids are found 9-10 miles from where they were last seen in the middle of the woods, and it makes no sense. Or when they're found, they don't remember anything. That's another key point. A lot of times when the victims are found, they don't have a memory. Now, in the movie, we went to great details to show these phenomenal distances. In one case that Les Stroud tried to replicate was A 2-year-old boy disappeared at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, was found the next morning 9 miles away over 2 mountain ranges, and we ended up tracking him down and interviewed him. He's a man now, and the story is really, really strange. And he says, I have no memory of anything. And so the phenomenal heights, thousands of feet up into the mountains, a 2-year-old disappears, and yet they're found uphill, way uphill. So the distances, the heights, weather changes in conjunction either with the disappearance or the search. And this can be a lot of things, and you got to kind of use some common sense with this. If at the time the person disappears, a thunderstorm starts, a windstorm starts, a drastic weather change that affects the searchers, this happens a lot of times. And then as you're walking with a group of people, I've kind of coined this the point of separation. And if you're not thinking about it, it won't hit you right away. But there's a time when you're walking with this group and either you get tired or they pick up their pace or something happens and you get out of view, and that's the point that you disappear. And the group will say, they were just right there. I can't believe they got away. They were right here just a second ago. And then boom, they're gone. And when they bring the canines to that location, that's when they can't find a track or they walk in circles, they do this. Time of disappearance is usually late afternoon. And this next one, I only found this out after either talking to the victims or digging real deep and finding it in a coroner's report or deep in a law enforcement report. And that is that the victim had some type of disability or an illness that wasn't obvious to the people even who they were with, meaning that maybe they were a severe diabetic, maybe they had early Alzheimer's, maybe they were autistic. But it seems that this comes up more often than not, meaning that there's two ends of this intellectual spectrum that seem to be at play a lot, meaning you have a lot of people at one end that have severe disabilities and some type of illness or injury that puts them in this one end. And then on the other end, you have these physicians, physicists, and things that disappear that are equally bizarre, yet fit the same criteria. And then in this book, I figured this out, and it hasn't happened a lot. And it probably hasn't happened a lot because people don't talk about it. But there was an instance where a guy disappeared, and he happened to have a compass with him. And he talked to the law enforcement people, and he said, it was weird. Is part of the reason I got lost, I think, is my compass was malfunctioning the entire time I was out. And I wonder if that is something maybe inherently wrong with the equipment he had, or was there something in the environment that was affecting his equipment? And I don't know how many times people are even carrying compasses these days, but, we have these GPS devices and, with phones and things that you can pull up trail maps on. So I'm not sure if it's happening more and people are talking about it. Hey, they survived, you found me, great, and that's the end of it, and they don't want to say anything. It's something I'm trying to keep my eye on more and more. I throw it out there because a lot of times when I'm on these shows, I'll say something, and then I'll get some emails coming later on, and they'll say, I was in the woods one time, and my compass started doing circles on me, and I couldn't figure out why. When I started this, I didn't realize that there's a lot of things in boulders and granite that, maybe the common public doesn't even know about. But as I started this process of understanding where these cases were at, I took out a giant map of the U.S., and I just started to put pins in the map of where these people disappeared. And after a while, certain areas started to grow very large. And the largest cluster of disappearances fitting this profile anywhere in the world is Yosemite National Park. Now, what does Yosemite have that other places don't have? Probably one of the largest clusters of granite anywhere in the world. And the disappearances in Yosemite, I'm sure the thousands of people out there are thinking, somebody went into the woods and they were on a long hike and they just got lost, they fell off a cliff and died, nobody found them. Well, the reality is that there's a lot of these cases of super smart people who went into the park, dropped their stuff in a hotel room, and asked somebody, hey, can we go here or there? And they give them directions to a location. They're on foot. They don't have a backpack. They don't have hiking shoes on, and they disappear. And this has happened more times than I probably told you about in these shows. But Yosemite, for some reason, has a lot of these very, very strange disappearances. Many times the people are never found. Now, Yosemite also has this unusual activity with it in that the National Park Service, if I name a name and a location where somebody disappeared, and I have somebody else request the report, the Park Service will give it up. Now, in Yosemite, if somebody names a name and asks for a report, they will never give it up if that person's missing. And it's only to that one park that they won't give up any reports. And there's one case I've talked about every time I'm on the show. A girl disappeared named Stacy Harris. Case is 30 years old now, or more. And they will not release any details about the case. About 6 months ago, they released this. Well, they said, we're releasing case files. They never released the case file. They released some pictures, some articles about her. They will never release the incident report, even though it's classified as a missing person report. Every missing person report I've requested out of Yosemite has been denied. Yeah, initially, I was looking at just the U.S. and Canada because that's where the information could easily be gleaned from. Over time, and as people realize that this is an international issue, I started to get more cases from overseas. Last year, I took a trip to Australia. I spent 2 weeks there, and it was a book tour. But in between that, I went out and I met a family that was actually a U.S. family, Patrick and Elizabeth, Liz. And they helped us, and they took us around, and they showed us a series of disappearances that we were interested in near Leura, Leura, and it was directly adjacent to national parks. The profiles of these people that disappeared in that area were a direct hit to what we're talking about in the U.S. Now, it's the U.S., Canada, the U.K., Australia, and New Zealand would be the top places in the world right now where there are disappearances that match what we're talking about here. Now, I can almost guarantee for a fact there's other places in the world that match these disappearances as well. But for me, getting the information and getting reports out of these areas is difficult. Now, going there and doing it may be a probability, but as you know, that's super expensive to do. When we went to Australia and we visited some firehouses where people played a part in the search, we talked to other people that knew these victims, and when you start to get down to the nitty-gritty, I mean, in one case, this woman disappeared, and in the press, they said that she had early case of Alzheimer's, early onset, and she had the first early symptoms. Then when we talked to friends of hers, they said, that was a complete lie. I don't know why they put that in there. And that has happened many times in the U.S. on cases I've investigated as well. They say there's Alzheimer's early onset, and it's a complete lie. And it might be to try to explain away to the public why this is happening, but in reality, it's not happening for that reason. There's a lot of rationale in those cases in New Zealand, and if you ever get there, they have big mountains like we have in the United States, say in the Sierras or in the Rockies, and they have a lot of area above timberline where there's no big trees. And there's some disappearances there that mimic disappearances here, in that a person's above timberline and there's no place to hide, and they're last seen walking through this area, and of course it's mostly all rocky, bouldery area, and they disappear and they're never found, and their backpack's never found, and their coat's never found, and nothing's ever found. And in normal disappearances, people will start shedding things. You're carrying a backpack, and you're on your last leg. You're going to start getting rid of things. And it's not a wise thing to do. It's probably best just to stay in one place, huddle up on a knoll top or a ridge top, and wait for help and wait for aircraft to come and find you. But that's not how a lot of people do things when you're starting to, haven't had food, water, etc. But these disappearances in New Zealand mimic the disappearances in the States and in Canada almost identical. And one of the things I talked about when I talked at the Search and Rescue Conference was that in the books, the search and rescue books that are given to these volunteers and professionals that go out and look for these people, there's a 95th percentile, and they'll say, well, 95% of the time a person will be found in this area. But it doesn't address the other 5% of the times. And are we searching for 95% success, or are we searching for 100% success? And I can't tell you the number of times searchers have said, Dave, we've always thought about that, but we never want to talk about it. And then when they read the books and they realize, wow, these are just facts that he's put together. There's no opinions in here. There's no stating that there's a big monster out there taking people. What I'm saying is that these are facts that people all need to be aware of. And many search and rescue people have now stated, you know, Dave, we all know this is going on. We just don't want to talk about it. You finally put it in print. Well, during my presentation, I kind of took a breath, and this guy in the back row stands up, and he goes, I'm an Alaska State Trooper. And he goes, I'm going to tell you, Dave, that you're the first person who's ever wanted to talk about this kind of stuff. He says, we face this all the time in our searches. And anyone in here who's done a lot of searches realizes this happens all the time. And he goes, I don't know why we're talking about it more. And then his friend who's with him is another Alaska State Trooper, stands up and says, he's 100% right. You know, and then I start talking about the 95th percentile, and a lot of people, you're 100% right, George, are very uncomfortable talking about the topic because it's hard to argue the facts that are laid out. That's always a million-dollar question. Did they miss something within that 2-mile radius, or did the person go outside that radius? Well, one of the other vetting points, profile points that I talk about in my books is there have been hundreds of times where a deceased victim has been found inside that primary search perimeter, that 2-mile radius. They stumble onto it.
This could be happening throughout human history.
Guy I really respect, and I've read a lot of his research, and that's Jacques Vallée. And one of the cases that I've documented in past books occurred in 1752 in France. That's a confirmed case. And then just the other day, I participated in a Kickstarter on a book that Vallée wrote just recently. And I happened to be going through that book, and I found another case from the 1500s that he laid it out, and I couldn't have wrote it better. It was like a perfect match for what we're talking about. A lot of times someone goes missing, and they're found, thank goodness, it's over, and that's it, and there isn't a lot written about it. Other times, there's a lot that's documented by people who intrinsically have some interest as to why certain things happen. And you can almost tell by the tone in the article from the reporter that they were as intrigued about it as I am today, and they decided to write a lot. And, you know, it goes back to where it happened, the educational level at the time. And, I mean, going back hundreds of years, there weren't a lot of people that had that kind of education, and hard to find.
You've got some material from this year that shows that it is ongoing, starting with a guy named Danny Philipines.
Yeah, this case made big notoriety across the U.S. In fact, mainstream press picked it up because it was so unique. 49 years old, a Toronto fire captain, 28 years of service. February 7th, 2018, 4 o'clock. He's at the Whiteface Mountain Ski Resort in Lake Placid, about 40 miles south of the Canadian border. And every year, a group of current retired firefighters make the trip across. They spend a couple days skiing. Well, he was with a group of guys. One of his friends got tired. He said, well, I'll take one last run. Almost exactly the words that Grant Cox gave his friends when he took one last run. And he disappeared. Well, Danny's personal property was still in the lodge. Car was in the lot. His friend said, hey, he's got to be on the mountain. And a 6-day search, 7,000 hours, dogs, firefighters, nothing. And then, surprisingly, Danny calls his wife from downtown Sacramento and says, I have some kind of head injury. I'm not sure how I got here. I did take a ride in a truck for a certain period of time, like a trucker, and he dropped me off in Sacramento. And right now I'm at Sacramento International Airport, and I wanted to call you and tell you that I'm okay, but I don't really remember anything. Well, she said, call the sheriff. He calls the sheriff. They come out, and they take a picture of him wearing the same ski clothes and the same ski helmet he was wearing the day he went missing. And he came back and he spoke to the New York State Police about what happened. And they never released the details of that conversation. But the people in Toronto said that he was an absolutely rock-solid fire captain with no mental health issues.
They got a haircut, too, right?
Yeah, and some people emailed me about that. They said, well, first of all, where did he get the money for a haircut? And he also bought an iPhone because he didn't have a phone. Bought it in Sacramento. And what I tell people, I ski all the time, and I don't like taking my wallet with me, but I'll always take a credit card and slip it in my coat, so during the day I can stop on the hill and get something to eat. So him having a credit card, but he didn't have his wallet and he didn't have his passport, and he told the people in Sacramento, hey, I didn't fly here because I don't even have my passport, so I don't know how I got here. And one thing about that case that really rang true to me was him saying that he had a head injury. And he was wearing a helmet. And I'd be interested to see if that helmet had any damage to it. But it all kind of fits in. Why would he say he had a head injury? That's amazing.
You had another one, Dr. Jonathan Torguson, a physician from Montana.
So there's some interesting coincidences here. So Dr. Torguson disappears on the 17th of February, 10 days after Philipines disappears. Torguson disappears from Whitefish Mountain Ski Area, and Philipines disappears from Whiteface Mountain Ski Area. And Whitefish Mountain in Montana is also 40 miles south of the Canadian border, just like Whiteface Mountain. Is that just all mere coincidence? So Dr. Torguson lived in Montana, was an emergency room physician, kind of a staple in the community, and he decides, and he tells his family this, that he's going to ski outside the bounds of the ski area and actually take a padded path around the backside and make it down to the bottom. And a lot of people do this. It's not completely going off trail. Part of it is, but not all of it. And he took an avalanche beacon with him. That was smart. And he had his phone. He intended to ski the northeast side of the area. He never came home. Well, a lot of people don't know this, but there's a very wealthy person that lives up in northern Montana, Kalispell, Whitefish area, and he's funded this organization called Two Bear Air, Two Bear, B-E-A-R. And what it is, it's a helicopter emergency service that will pick anybody up for free in that northern Montana area, and it's funded full-time with 2 pilots. It's an unbelievable service that's funded up there privately. Well, Two Bear Air searched for this guy for days, and the Flathead Valley Avalanche Rescue responded, the sheriff, North Valley Search and Rescue, Gallatin County, Lewis and Clark County, and they all thought he might have fallen in a tree well, and that's this area around a tree that has this deep hole in it that sometimes claims a skier's life. They searched those holes one by one all through that area, and they pinged his cell phone, and it was last on near a ridgeline near this area called Kona and Flower Mount. It snowed heavily, wind was brutal during the search. They didn't find him. To me, it's strange, not only the facts surrounding this, but also it's a physician. And in this book, Off the Grid, I write about a lot of physicians that have disappeared under very, very strange circumstances. And it goes towards that intellect on that far end of the spectrum that seem to disappear at higher levels than most. You know, and I wish the National Park Service would get on board with this, because there is a device. It's a personal locator beacon. And if you guys people ever watch, Deadliest Catch, every boat out there on the Bering Sea has one of these waterproof location devices. Well, you can buy one. It costs you a couple $100, and it works off a satellite. And if you're lost, you need help, you activate it, and within 10 feet, search and rescue can come and find you. And these things aren't as well known as people tend to think. And when I go to conferences, I'm surprised how many people have never heard of this. Yet anybody who walks in the woods by themselves needs one. And what I tell people is that you never think it's going to happen to you. You could be in the middle of the woods on the backside of some trail, off the trail, break your leg. Chances are no one is going to find you, and you're going to die out there. Well, the funny thing was, here I am preaching about this, and I was in Australia 2 years ago filming a segment on a missing person, and what did I do? I was carrying a huge camera rig, and it was raining. It had rained previously. I slipped over a boulder, and I broke my leg. I ended up being able to walk out with a straight break, but it was ugly. If I would have been by myself, I could have been in trouble. Now, Shuka was an employee of a ski resort called Sun Peaks, and it's just outside of Kamloops, British Columbia, 120 miles north of the U.S. border. And I'd worked there the entire season. It was the end of the season party. And he's walking from the party to his house just down the street, and he disappears. Now, he knew this this area by the back of his hand. He walked it every day all year. Well, the RCMP sent in multiple search dogs, multiple helicopters, 100 searchers. There was no evidence from anyone that he left the village that he was staying in. And his parents, Heather and Scott, were on scene daily. His dad used to be a heavy equipment operator and brought in a backhoe and cleared snow looking for his son. Now, the weird thing was there were a lot of closed-circuit televisions in this little community, and none of them happened to be working, so they couldn't see where his movements were at. And this search went on for weeks, and in fact, just up until a couple weeks ago, it was still going on, and his parents were still there. And I guess the hopes is that with a spring thaw, they'll be able to find him. But how he disappeared in such a short period of time, walking such a short distance, there's only one other place I know of that things like this have happened, and there's two cases very similar to this that have happened in Whistler, British Columbia. One was a guy and one was a girl. The girl happened this year. Very, very similar circumstances. You know, in the UK, I wrote a book called Missing 411, Sobering Coincidence, where I documented a series of young men that have vanished and were later found in water. And it's strange the way those things have happened, but in those little communities in the UK, there's a lot of cameras. And in almost every one of those instances, the person was seen, and then all of a sudden they weren't seen, and then the next thing is a week later they're found in the water. How they ended up in the water, that's the million-dollar question. It's normally not a closed-circuit television issue, and a lot of times they have given some insight from searchers as to what might have happened. But in this instance, it's strange that they weren't operating. These were out for a while.
One other one that happened in March. This is Thomas Malarkey.
So Malarkey, this is in Bear Valley, California. He was an electrician, and this is an area where I've actually been through a lot with my daughter Nicole and my son Ben. We spent a lot of time up in the Sierras, up around Tahoe. And in this area of Calaveras County where they have the frog jump, Mr. Malarkey was a Richmond resident, and he had a cabin outside of Arnold, kind of near Bear Valley. And he liked to ski. He was an advanced skier. And his wife decided to stay in the cabin this day, and he went up to Bear Valley. Now, this is the second incident I've written about from Bear Valley. And you can add up all the ski resorts in the U.S., and there aren't a handful of them that have had these disappearances, yet this is the second one in Bear Valley. I've skied that place many times. I don't understand how you get lost, and I don't understand how they couldn't find you. But he disappears. The search is termed on March 20th after the California Highway Patrol and the National Guard helicopters were grounded because it was snowing so hard. And there was 35 inches of snow that fell in 72 hours. That's a lot of snow for that area. But there was an army of people that responded. Calaveras County, Alpine County, CHP, Air National Guard, and many volunteers. The family gave an interview and said, this is one of the true, real mysteries that we'll never understand, is how our dad wasn't found.
In the Missing 411 Off the Grid, that you have all these quotations in the back from search and rescue people. And the one that jumps out at me, it was involving one of the rare cases where somebody comes back and they have shreds of memory. It's a little boy who believes that he was in the presence of a big kangaroo.
I try to tell people, don't put a lot of credence into what kids say. But it's been a big kangaroo, a big wolf, a big dog. One incident, the girl said the dog took my hat off my head as he was holding me and put it in its mouth. So kids have said the damnedest things, and you don't know if they're making it up or if it's truthful. But the big kangaroo one, that one was odd because I've never heard anything close to that before. Who knows really what's happening? And I've never said that any one specific thing stands out, because when you look at the overwhelming evidence and you go back and you look at the geographical cluster map, it really throws it all into a loop. So the boulder issue is one that I've written about extensively, and it has to do with granite predominantly. And the biggest cluster of missing people anywhere in the world that fit our profile is Yosemite National Park. And what does Yosemite have? But probably more granite than anywhere in the world. And one of the last stories in this last book dealt with a priest that was running from a group of people in the late 1800s, and he ran onto this giant piece of granite, and it said that the granite opened up and swallowed him. And a couple days later, he said he was spit out. And then what's interesting to that to me is that it was a religious figure, and at the time, we always thought that those figures that wrote stories that held a lot of credibility in the world. And for him to write that, I thought was pretty phenomenal. But walking around boulders and getting out of sight from people would not be something I would do. And when I'm in those boulder fields, I make sure that I'm with somebody. They see me, I see them. I don't know what goes on in those boulder fields, but it's not good.
You have those cases where the clothes are folded. You have other cases where the shoes, there's always something weird happening with shoes.
Well, it's especially tough to explain, especially when you're dealing with kids that have walked, 60, 70 miles and supposedly didn't have shoes on and didn't have them at the time that they were found. How did they make it those distances? And what I explain to people is that search and rescue people are so thorough. They're told to pick up anything on the ground and make a note of it where they found it because it could be relevant to the case that they're working. And a lot of times they'll bring in all kinds of stuff, and the vast majority of the time it's not related to the person that's missing. But it shows how thorough they are. One of the guys that I work with is a guy named Harvey Pratt. He used to be one of the directors at the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, and he's also a Native American chief. A couple of weeks ago, Harvey and I were talking about Native American disappearances on reservations. He had a conversation with one of the Bureau of Indian Affairs captains, and the question had to do with how do they retrieve reports out of their system when they need to go to court, et cetera. And this guy at the time said that's one of the problems. They're having a difficult time finding out where these reports are going and how they're tracked. And it's one of those federal investigative agencies that seems as though it has the inherent problems that the National Park Service and the U.S. Forest Service has. Now, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they're greatly underfunded and they don't have enough investigators. But the disappearances of women on reservations is a serious issue. It doesn't overlap with what we're doing, but it's a serious issue. Well, we didn't get to talk about it tonight, but the one last case involved a German individual that disappeared skiing on the Matterhorn just a month ago, and they gave up the search for him. And he's a billionaire from Germany, and you know that they threw every resource in the book trying to find him, and they didn't. So I think that the German side of the equation has something that we really don't understand, but there's something there. And when you look at the physicist angle, why are these guys disappearing and why can't we find them? That's a real bothersome question.
And David, we've got more cases, this one of a missing firefighter. Tell us what we know about Mike Herdman, the missing firefighter.
So he went hiking up in the Los Padres National Forest in an area called the Sespe Wilderness on June 13th with a fellow firefighter, paramedic from Arcadia. Mike's a married man, father, has a small daughter. He has a lot of experience in the woods. The guy he was with didn't have a lot of experience, but they hiked far in to the wilderness, started to set up camp. Mike brought his dog with him, and just as they were setting up camp, Mike was wearing a pair of shorts and a shirt, and that's it. And for some reason, his dog just took off straight into the woods. Well, the individual that Mike was with saw Mike take off running into the woods for the dog named Duke, and that was the last that Tyler Byers, the other firefighter, ever saw of Mike Herdman. And Tyler stuck around, called for Mike during the night, yelled for him throughout the night, eventually gave up and decided to hike out the next day, which was an all-day deal. So by the time that search and rescue finally got on it, it was probably a day and a half into the disappearance. Now, what's interesting is that in the last 5 years, we've been doing research into the missing people in the woods scenario. And a couple of things about this are exactly on key for what we found.
Okay.
Namely, a lot of people disappear with a dog or chasing a dog into the wilderness. And this is exactly what happened to Mike. Second part of that scenario is when people disappear, when they're found without shoes or other pieces of clothing. Well, Mike disappeared with no shoes. And
now, did he have shoes on when he went running into the woods?
No, which is kind of strange. I mean, you think maybe you'd take a 10, 20 seconds, just throw your
shoes on.
But no, he didn't. Now, right after this happened, I got an email from someone and said, do you understand the area that Mike disappeared in? And I got to be honest, at the beginning I didn't. And they sent me to a website, and the name of my latest book is Missing 411, The Devil's in the Detail. The website they sent me to, it's about the Sespe Wilderness and the Condor Sanctuary that's in the wilderness. And darn, if the name of that website isn't The Devil's in the Detail.
Oh, my God.
I was floored. And the reason the guy came up with that is because there are so many devil names, geographical locations inside this area. There's an area called Devil's Heart Peak, which is in the center of the Sespe Wilderness, right near the Condor Sanctuary. There's another place called the Devil's Gateway, another place called the Devil's Potrero. And the reason I named my book that is because a lot of people over the last 5 years that we've done research on have disappeared in those geographical areas where there's devil in the name. I tell you, the people that I'm around, that I talk to every day, that I work with, we look each other in the eye sometimes and can't believe what we found. There's a lot of people that sent me emails that said, well, we think he fell as he ran into the woods and maybe he broke his leg and he can't get out. And I explained that Tyler Byers took the search crew into the location where Mike disappeared. And there's been 200 people searching for a week in a grid pattern out of that area. And if Mike did break his leg, he can still yell for help. Number two, they got permission from the Forest Service to throw drones up into the sky, along with some helicopters with FLIR that are looking for a specific heat pattern from people. And they haven't come up with any images. Now, one thing that everyone was looking for was his dog, Duke. And searchers had seen him during that week running around, but they couldn't get him. And then on Sunday, June 22nd, 9 days after he disappeared, Duke showed up at the trailhead where Mike's car was originally parked.
Did they catch him?
They got him.
Without Mike?
No Mike. And they said that he looked a little weathered, a little beaten up just from the elements. And they were going to take him in and give him some injections of something and try to get him going, but the dog did not appear like it wanted to go back into the woods.
But if a guy goes chasing his dog, how far is he going to go?
If it was me, I'm not going at all into the woods. I'm going to wait another 10 or 20 seconds until I can just throw my shoes on. There's something about this phenomena that's real, that we've documented through factual cases, that very few people have ever denied. And Herdman's case, we've gotten hundreds of emails saying, you got to be aware of this, you got to be following this, and we are. And I got to say, up to this point, it fits exactly into what we've written about in the past. These things don't happen back to back to back in a specific area. Otherwise, everyone would take notice of it. These are always separated by 8, 9 years minimum, sometimes 15 or 20 years. So you go from 97 to August 8, 2005, and Anita Mayo was a resident of Hawthorne, Nevada. She was a licensed practical nurse working at Mount Grant Hospital. And she was driving over into California to visit some relatives. She was driving a 97 Mercury Sable station wagon, and she pulled into Strawberry, and she bought some trinkets in the store. And after she left Strawberry, she drove out to the Vista, and apparently, from what everyone can find, the only thing that was missing was her camera. The doors were locked. Caltrans people found the car. The purse, the keys, the cell phone were in the car. And her prescription glasses, they also said, were missing. This is another subgroup that we've talked about in the books, and that is photographers. People that go missing in the woods carrying a camera with specific intent to take pictures. They vanish. Nita vanished, and they took the car as evidence. They've never had one clue as to what happened to this woman. Now, fast forward 9 years, Patty Sue Albright, 46 years old. She owned a restaurant in Sonora, well known in the community. She's going to go take a hike in Kennedy Meadows, she told some people. For some reason or another, she turned into Donnell Vista Lookout in her Toyota 4Runner. The sunroof was open, and they found the car with the roof open. Apparently it had rained, and the keys to the car were gone. Her purse was inside the car, and she was nowhere to be found. Giant search of that surrounding area. She's never been found.
Gosh.
As I've stated before, whatever is doing this, they've never made a mistake, because if they had made a mistake, you or I would have heard about it. So I'll tell you a story that came into us. A person was hunting up in Colorado, and he said he was trucking along a trail, hunting, was trying to get to a location, so was moving kind of fast, and he said he saw something ahead of him that almost looked like you were looking in a warped mirror that wasn't real clear. And he goes, I slowed down almost to a crawl, and I approached this, and he says, I swear to you, I put one foot forward as I was stopped, and I lost sight of my foot, but I could see part of my leg, almost like you're putting it into a wall. He says, I pulled my foot back through and started to back away because whatever it was not good. But as you move forward, and if you're a researcher and you stick with the profile that's established, but you keep an open mind, there were 3 guys that were fishing off the coast of Florida, and they happened to be jockeys, really, really good jockeys, that were going to be in the Kentucky Derby and Belmont in a couple months. And they were fishing in a small skiff that was being watched by a big yacht. Immediately, as they get in position in water that's only 2 or 3 feet deep, a storm comes in. Part of the profile, there's bad weather associated with these disappearances. And a storm comes in to the point where they get washed away from this boat into a small little cove. Make a long story short, this boat goes in as far as it can. Not only were the 3 guys never found, none of their equipment was ever found, and it was in one of the biggest searches ever in Florida at that point. The author of one of the articles we read said, these guys could have just gotten out of the boat and walked ashore.
But they didn't.
No, it was a small island, and they were never found. There is no doubt in my mind that something extremely unusual is happening to these people, and I wish I could nail it, and maybe with time we can. One of the stories in the new book involves a boy named Clarence Murphy, and he was vacationing in the Central Sierras in a place called Camp Sacramento, which is at about 6,000 feet. It's a place where families go to take their kids. It's right next to the American River. Clarence was vacationing with his mom. He was in a sandbox at the camp, and his mom just stepped away for a couple minutes. And she came back, and he wasn't in the sandbox. And they had a conversation, and he said he would stay there. And they searched. Initially, all the searchers usually go to the river, or they go to the lake, and they search hard there, and that's usually where kids ended up being found. But in the cases here, that's not where they're found. That's not where they go. And Clarence, whether it was against his will or with his will or whatever, he went uphill. And I can tell you, as an adult, when you're at 6,000 feet, and you have a choice between going uphill or downhill, you're going to go downhill because it takes the wind out of you at that elevation. Initially, they searched for 2 weeks. They never found him. And they searched hard. They pulled out everything they could to find this boy. Well, fast forward from April 14th, 41, 14 months later to September 22nd, 42, there was a deer hunter that was up a ridgeline 2,000 feet uphill, 2 miles from where Clarence disappeared, and he saw a shoe on the ground. But he was in an area that would remind you a lot of Yosemite because there's a place there called Lover's Leap. I've been in this area many times. It's filled with just huge pieces of granite boulder fields. It's a hell-forsaken place, great place for deer hunting. And this hunter was on his horse, and I think that's probably the only reason he was there because it's so rugged. They brought up multiple canines. In fact, in every story in my books, the canines failed to pick up a scent that eventually finds the victim. For a search dog to just lay down at that time or not want to track, these searchers that had the canines, they said it's one of 2 things. Either there's no scent there, or it's extreme fear on the dog's side for some reason that we can't comprehend. Yeah, that's an interesting case from Central California. A woman disappeared from, she's a very wealthy lady. She disappeared from her kind of a rural ranch, and there was a lot of suspicion that the family was involved, and a lot of inner griping going on and finger pointing, etc. But they didn't find her for months and months. And then somebody said that they thought this lady picking berries off a berry bush in this remote location near Lake Berryessa. And she was eventually found wearing overalls, like men's overalls, and shoes, where she was for the previous 2 months, how she survived, where she got the clothes. There were a million unanswered questions with that case, but in many ways it mimicked other elements that we see in these cases, so that's why it was included.
We're with Dave Paulides talking about the case of Todd Gu, and this case really gets creepy.
So, catch up is a massive search. Todd isn't being found. Canines aren't finding a scent. Helicopters aren't seeing anything from the skies. All the swamps were searched. All the lakes in the area were searched. Nothing's found. His residence is on west side of a place called Half Moon Lake, kind of on the correct side as the party. Party was on the west side of the road as well. And as the searchers are going, there's one small body of water on the west side as well, and it's called Ovid Hall Lake. It's about 1,000 feet long, and it's narrow. It had been looked at many, many times. It's not easily acceptable. Some locals fish it. You can't drive to it, and you have to walk to it, and it's a tough walk. It's in the exact opposite direction of where Todd needed to go from the party to his house. Well, people did fish the lake from May 17th to May 18th afterwards, and they were using a fish finder, and they combed the lake from top to bottom, left to right. There was nothing in the lake. The people were interviewed multiple times. On July 2nd at 5 p.m., a husband and wife were walking down to the lake, and they saw what they described as something really odd protruding from the water. This is July 2nd. There's no ice. You know, it's a warm Michigan day. They walk down, and it's Todd's body. And the witnesses said in the reports that he was floating like a bobber. Todd's hat, his cell phone, and one shoe were missing. He was totally gone for 21 days. His location absolutely shocked everyone because it was on that opposite direction that he should have been going. The on-scene coroner classified in his report the case as suspicious, which is never done unless there's a crime involved. The coroner couldn't find any rigor mortis in the body. There was no ice in the lake. He couldn't determine if any lividity was present at all. And again, you always find lividity in bodies, except in these cases. Decomposition was classified as intermediate to moderate. He had the hair still on his head, and there was swelling around his eyelids. They couldn't determine the color of his iris. That's the colored portion of your eye. Now, when Gannon and Gilbertson looked at this case, they described his body as being pristine for being in the water 21 days. His blood alcohol level came back at 0.12%, just a little over the legal limit for driving. A toxicology showed that he had what's called contanine. It's a byproduct of smoking. But highly unusual is they found something called despermine. It's a depression medication. Todd wasn't on depression medication. He wasn't taking any drugs. He was a very level-headed guy. They also found something called amitriptyline in his system. And again, he didn't take drugs. They couldn't believe that they found this stuff. They couldn't determine the cause of death. It was listed as undetermined how he died, even though drowning was a possibility. They didn't find any water in his lungs. It's another case where the parents reach out to Dr. Cyril Wecht. He reviewed the case. He said that Todd had to have been unconscious when he entered the water. The photos of the body were taken to a medical examiner's conference, and it was the unanimous opinion of all the medical examiners that looked at the pictures is that the body wasn't in the water for 20-plus days. The opinion was that Todd was out of the water 15 to 18 days, placed in the water. The family tried to get the Michigan police to change the cause of death. They wouldn't look at it. They wouldn't have anything to do with it. Now, everyone needs to understand something. Police departments, cities, counties, they work off of statistics. And most police chiefs want to keep that homicide statistic down because it's bad for business. And again, I'm going to present you with facts, not opinions about what's going on. The fact is, Todd wasn't in that water for that entire period of time. And the other part of this that people can't forget is the positioning of the body that's being found in these cases, completely outside the bounds of what's normal. What's causing the bodies to end up in this position? Nobody knows. But something unusual, highly unusual, is happening. And yes, in every one of these cases, the parents are saying, there's no way this is my son. There's no way this happened. He knew this area like his backyard. He's not going to be walking in the other direction. But it's irrelevant. He didn't go the other direction. It's proven through a scientific forensics. Todd Gu and these other people that we've talked about were not in the water the entire time. Now, in my previous books, I write about these victims being found in areas that were previously searched. They're dropped into an area, they're placed into an area somehow where they guaranteed weren't in the area before. When they're found, if they're found alive, they're found in this semi-conscious or unconscious state. You got to remember something. The canines, there's no tracks leaving the area. The canines, there's no scent leaving the area. So even if somebody would have picked Todd up and carried him out of the area, chances are trackers, etc., would have tracked him out of the area. They would have found his scent someplace else. But then again, he wasn't in the water the entire time. So that means he was held. Nobody, I don't care who you are, in 125 cases leaves no evidence behind. And really, there's no evidence behind of who's doing this or what's happening.
Let's talk about Shane Montgomery. This is in Philadelphia, 2014.
I've written time and time again about the FBI. And the FBI are the best in the world at documentation. I don't care what you say; these guys are these guys and ladies are the best. And they could go and they could sit and they monitor a case. They don't get involved, but they just sit and watch and they listen and they write. And these reports go back to their profiling unit for review and classification. And they're the best at profiling. They're the best at accumulating data. And in my past books, I've said that the FBI continually are on scene at some of these crimes, and they're writing, and they are not idiots. They know what I know, and I'm sure for a fact they know 10,000 times more. But they seem to show up. The Shane Montgomery case, to me, is a turning point for the FBI involvement, because from the time Shane went missing, the FBI was on the scene. And just not the FBI agents themselves, the FBI abduction task force agents were there, yet there was no evidence of a crime. November 27, 2014 is when Shane, 21 years old, Philadelphia, PA, he was a graduate of a Roman Catholic high school. I'll stop there again. You're going to continually hear me say that the majority of these people that disappeared have some strong religious affiliations. Shane did. Graduated from a Roman Catholic high school and was attending Westchester University in Philly. On November 26th, he was at his cousin's house, and both decided they were going to go to a bar and have some drinks. At about 1:15 a.m., Shane sent a text to his cousin saying he was in the bar but couldn't locate his cousin. At 1:28, he called another friend and said, "Do you know where my cousin's at?" Got no answer, couldn't find him. At 1:45, he bumped into something in the restaurant, and he was told that it's near 2 a.m., you guys got to leave. People said there was no way he was staggering drunk. He left the bar and was never seen again. He didn't show up for a family event on November 27th, late in the day, and the family reported him as a missing person. From the first day Philadelphia police started working this event, the FBI was there interviewing staff at the bar at Cadell's Pub. This is the first time I've ever seen the FBI there interviewing staff on an incident where there was no evidence of a crime, and Philadelphia police said there was no evidence of a crime. They were just investigating. Well, the FBI doesn't investigate missing people. Now, they did locate a closed-circuit television footage of Shane crossing between a pub and a parking lot over a small footbridge of a canal. The footbridge passed over what was called Manayunk Canal, which paralleled the Schuylkill River. Shortly after he disappeared, the parents convinced Garden State Underwater Recovery Team to come in and start searching the water for their son, because there was really no other place for him to go in their mind. And the first break came on December 21st. Now, that was almost 3 weeks after he disappeared. This team is so good, they found Shane's keys in the river. Not in the canal they saw him walking over, but in the river. And that to me is just unbelievable they found the keys. And the search was initially focused on that canal, but when they cleared it, they moved to the river. Now, what's fascinating about this is that one of the detectives on the case was interviewed by a news team, and he was standing next to the river they were talking about Shane, and he said, well, if Shane's in the river, he's miles downstream at this point because the river's flowing so fast. And they said, oh, okay, and they interviewed him about some other stuff. Well, the same underwater recovery team that found his keys in 10 feet of water continued to look, and they looked behind a variety of locations in the area he was in. Well, days later, almost a month after he disappeared, they found his body in an exact location right behind where he was seen in an area that had been searched many times behind a brewery. And this was in the exact location where he was seen on CCTV. Now, how did he end up in the river behind the brewery in a location that had been searched many times when the detective said there's no way he'd be anywhere near there, it'd be washed all downstream? That was funny. That didn't make any sense. And the family said that the coroner told them that the cause of death was accident, but they never stated exactly what caused the death. The body was assisted and reported and investigated by not only the FBI but local Philadelphia authorities. And the coroner and the medical examiner have never released the report on the cause of death nor the blood alcohol level. What's interesting about this is back when I was a cop, there was a girl who disappeared in Petaluma, California named Paulides. And the FBI were pulled, and they all flew in the next day, and they worked this case with Paulides. One of the abduction task force agents knew one of our guys and said, yeah, pick yourself and one other guy and come up here. And I was the other guy. And these abduction task force guys, they are the best of the best. I often tell people, the average FBI agent probably doesn't put his handcuffs on a person once a year. They are all ex-cops. They are really on top of things. If I ever had a family member disappeared, these are the guys I want looking into it because they are great. And in a way, it makes me feel better. But in another way, I know that whatever they find, we'll never know because they'll never say, they won't even tell the other police officers working cases next to them what they know sometimes. In Missing 411 Eastern U.S., I wrote about an entire series of disappearances that occurred in the Great Smoky Mountains. And there was one specific FBI agent that was assigned to follow these strange disappearances of people in the woods. And I forgot how many times, but it was a lot of times. It was the same agent, the same name, time after time. And all he would say is, we're monitoring the case, we're monitoring the case. Well, when I interviewed one of the victims' dads, Dennis Martin, and I asked him, I said, well, what is there about this case that I don't know? Because I think I probably know everything in print. And he says, you know that FBI agent that worked all the cases here? I go, yeah, his last name was Reich. He says, exactly. He goes, do you ever know what happened to Agent Reich? I said, no. He says, he committed suicide.
Let's go to Stephen Kabacki.
So Stephen, 23 years old at the time, February 19th, 78, another February disappearance, this time in Holland, Michigan. And it's interesting that we're talking about Todd Gu. Holland is just north of Casnovia, also in an area where there's been these clusters of strange disappearances. And also, Stephen, again, was strong religious ties. He was going to Hope College, which is part of the Reformed Church of America. This location that he was at is 30 miles north of South Haven, 76 miles south of Ludington and Baldwin, the cluster area I was telling you about. In February of 78, Stephen was attending Hope, and this is the part that's going to sound strange again. He was trying to get a degree in German. On February 19th, Todd told his roommates he was going to go cross-country skiing along Lake Michigan near Saugatuck, and when he didn't return, they filed a missing persons report. The Michigan State Police led the search, and they pulled out every stop imaginable. The Coast Guard on Lake Michigan went out, tracking dogs, helicopters, foot patrols, and the state police found his skis and his poles on the beach of Lake Michigan, and they saw footprints on the ice leading out 200 yards out onto the lake. And they flew over it, and the footprints just appeared to stop. And they thought at the time that because it had been a couple days that maybe he had just fallen through the ice, and because there were no tracks coming back. And another report stated that they found his backpack in the same general area. So he was essentially separated from everything he had and apparently walked out on the ice. And the determination that after a couple weeks searches, police wrote down that they believed he died and drowned on the lake. Now, fast forward to May 5th, 79. This all occurred February 1978. So, you're looking at about 15 months later. Stephen says he woke up in a field on a Saturday night, 40 miles from his father's house in Deerfield, Massachusetts. John Kubacki was his dad. 53-year-old father told in interviews, he goes, I thought my son was dead. And he said that he walked up to the door and said that he doesn't remember a lot. He woke up in Pittsfield, said he was lying in a meadow, and he was wearing clothes that weren't his. Now, this is 700 miles east of Lake Michigan, almost in a straight line. Now, in 1983, Stephen went back out and got an MA in linguistics from Ohio University, and in 92, he went back to the University of New Mexico and got a PhD in clinical psychology. I tracked him down into Washington. I called, tried to make contact with him, told the receptionist I wanted to talk to him, sent him a personal email that I wanted to talk to him. He would never respond. And what's important about this, he's a missing student. He's missing in an area that is quoted as the Great Lakes Triangle, and I talk about this in my book, that talks about a series of disappearances in and around the water of people, planes, and boats that are as unusual as the disappearances I talk about in my book. Stephen's missing time and space, and reporters asked him if he'd ever see a psychiatrist, and he said no, because I don't have any problems. In all of the articles I pulled on this, it never said that the police took an interest in it, never said that, because if you think about it, there was no crime that occurred. Remember, anybody can disappear, and it's not a crime. Now, there's some pretty strong evidence that he walked out on the ice right directly from where his skis and things were. So where was he for 15 months? He says he wakes up in a field wearing somebody else's clothes. He said that there was other things in a small satchel that was next to him that were maps and things that weren't his, and he doesn't know where it came from. There's been some of the most competent police officers and detectives around that have said, hey, these are abductions. People don't want to admit it. They don't want to sit there and address the facts. But I'd go toe-to-toe with anybody to say, hey, show me that they're not.
I was talking earlier about distance traveled. So there was a man named Lawrence Marsh, and he and his wife had a son that was 19 months old. This happened in June 15th, 1907. And it was about 15 miles northwest of Caldwell, Idaho, and that's about 5 miles west of Boise. And they lived in a very rural home. Well, at about 6 p.m., the parents couldn't find their boy. They called for him, they yelled for him, ran around the yard. They couldn't find him. Well, they go out, and they get every neighbor they can, and pretty soon they have 100 people looking. And then they call, one of the people had the ability to get a hold of the local sheriff. The sheriff comes out, gets some firefighters out there. And then the sheriff sends a man, one of his men, to the local penitentiary to get the bloodhounds out to that site to help them look for the kid. Well, the bloodhounds came out. They ended up searching for 16 hours. They weren't finding anything. On June 20th, about 5 days after he disappears, they're looking around, and one searcher by himself thought he was way too far, but he just had a hunch, and he was walking around, and he found a few of the boy's tracks. And then he walked up on the boy, and he was still alive, and he was 8 miles from the house, 19 months old. I mean, some people will say, well, yeah, my kid's real energetic. But to make it over a span of time that long and to still be alive and to cover that much ground, because people don't understand that young children, they live by habits. When it gets dark outside, they'll lay down and go to sleep. And they won't get up in the dark. They'll sleep and get up in the morning and dilly around in the dirt a little bit. A lot of times search and rescue people say, number one, they never walk a straight line. So if they're gone 8 miles from the point they were last seen, they probably walked 16 miles, if they walked it. I think it defies everything in search and rescue manuals, and it defies common sense, George. There's a group out of British Columbia that historically has had some of the strangest cases ever, and their leader of their search and rescue won't talk to anybody about what happens. And it's like I think he's afraid that someone's going to make fun of him or someone's going to challenge him on what he says happens, but the truth of the matter is what he's reporting is happening all over the world. And I've written about this stuff in 16 different countries, so it's nothing confined to just North America. And the truth of the matter is, the more I hear these stories, the more I start to think, well, it can't be this, it can't be that. Like an example, I have several people that have owned property that's been in their family for 50, 60 years. Every year they go hunting on the same piece of property, or they go hiking. And they say, Dave, there's a ridgeline. I've walked down it 1,000 times. One time I'm walking down the ridgeline, and then all of a sudden, everything in front of me doesn't even look familiar at all. There's a pond there. I even saw a cabin. And
like they walked into a different dimension or something.
Bingo. And they said, I don't remember crossing into anything. I don't remember weather change. But he says, I was there for maybe an hour. I was scared to death. Then all of a sudden I walk out, and I realize where I am. And Dave, I spent 10 years trying to find this cabin or this location again. And I don't think it exists, but I don't know what happened. And I've heard a similar story probably 10 times from different people. I made a show called Vanished. Over that show, they introduced me to several different people, and one was a physicist, Dr. Brandenburg. And we talked as much off-camera as we did on-camera, and he's a consultant for NASA. We started to talk about portals. And he said, Dave, he said, I'm part of a group of physicists, theoreticals, that sit around and talk about this kind of thing all the time. And there's groups right now in the world that are trying to weaponize a portal. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he says, so imagine pointing a portal at like a battalion of troops and just taking them away. And I said, so this is feasible? He goes, yeah, we think it is. And he said, Dave, I know about your work. And he said, about the stories about the kids standing right next to the parents, or that time where a hiker is ahead of the group around the corner. The group comes around the corner, the person's gone. It's like somebody was watching them and they were gone. And he says, so it almost falls in line in my mind, this is Brandenburg talking, that somebody already is using that technology on your participants somehow. So this isn't me. This is part of the conversation with Brandenburg as well. He says, what we don't understand is that time from point to point. Where are they going? What are they doing? How long are they in this limbo stage?
Mm-hmm.
And then we had this talk about Star Trek, when people are beamed up from a planet onto the Enterprise. And he said, some people don't make that trip well. Some people may get hung up. We don't understand it. I can tell you that according to Brandenburg, who, like I said, is a consultant for NASA, he's a smart guy, it's something that they're researching right now. One thing that when we were talking about portals with Brandenburg is, if they were random, if they were not manipulated, then why couldn't somebody walking down, Broadway in New York see somebody in front of them disappear? But you don't hear of that. Georgia, I keep an open mind because there's too many things it could be at this point. And if you look, there's cases on different sides of the United States, sometimes on the same day. Angie and I spent a week in Idaho going to all these spots. And one of the places, probably 20 miles outside of Grangeville, just east of there, is a place called Elk City. Now, Elk City is famous in my mind for an incident that happened there. And I've got to set this up. And it involves two cases in one day, George.
All right.
The first one involves a woman named Connie Johnson. Connie was 76 years old, and she was a U.S. Forest Service backcountry ranger for 20 years. And she worked at the Moose Creek Ranger Station off of the Selway River. Well, when she retired, she started working for an outfitter as their camp cook on Fog Mountain. And she was last seen when they dropped her off at the camp on October 2nd. A couple days later, they tried to reach her on the radio. She said something, but they couldn't tell what it was. On October 5th, they go in, and they can't find her or her dog that was with her when they dropped her off. That bothered everybody. They knew that she wouldn't get lost. And what happened was that eventually the world came in and started looking for Connie. Now, right outside of Elk City, there is a place called the Penman Mine, Penman. And there was a film crew there at the Penman Mine on October 5th, 2018, same day Connie disappeared. And they were filming a segment. And one story is that this production crew out of the UK was filming about ghosts. Another segment said that it was part of this show about searching for gold. Whatever the story was, we went there. We talked to the people who were on scene, and this production crew hired some locals to drive in on ATVs up this rugged dirt road to this mine. And they were standing around at the end of the day on October 5th, and one of the members of their team looks at everybody, is standing at a super steep hill, and just takes off at a dead run into the middle of nothingness. Everyone just looks stunned, like, where's he going?
Yeah.
And they said he ran like the wind, and nobody ever saw him again. Couple of the crew members tried to chase him down, couldn't do it. So they go back down the bottom of this hill, and the first house they get to is one of these guys who lives part of the summer in this area and hunts in that area during October. And I met this person, and he said, Dave, the crew was stunned. Nobody could believe what this person did, and it was all validated by this local and this team that brought him in there. Make a long story short, now they have 2 missing people, big cases in the same jurisdiction, in the same county, and they're looking for these people. Well, in both instances, neither person was ever found. In Connie's case, her dog Ace turns up 14 days later, 14 miles away at the U.S. Forest Service camp where she worked at for 20 years. And the dog walked up to one of the pilots that's working on their plane on the dirt strip, and everyone knew who the dog was. They ended up bringing the dog back into the hunting camp, hoping to take him to Connie, but the dog didn't lead that way. But in one of the strangest things I've ever documented, number one, 2 cases in the same county in the same day, different incidents, both people never found, no explanation, completely bizarre. So another story. When we were filming Vanished, we were at Mesa Verde National Park, and we were there about a case of a man that disappeared there named Dale Staling. Now, Dale just took off on a normal hike. People saw him on the trail, and he was in a great mood, and then he just suddenly disappears. Well, a couple days later, searches go in full bore. A local newspaper reporter had a meeting with the park superintendent about just the park in general. She was going to write a story. She didn't even know anybody was missing. So she gets there, and it's chaos. And the superintendent says, hey, go take a hike or something. Come back in an hour, and I'll give you the interview. She doesn't know it, but she goes down the same trail where Dale disappeared. And about 3 miles down the trail, she stops because she hears somebody calling for help. And she goes, where are you? And the person isn't answering. They just say, hey, I need your help. I'm hurt, blah, blah, blah. And she's very flustered. She runs back to the superintendent's office, runs into their meeting, says, hey, guys, we got an injured hiker out there. We need help right now. I'll take you guys out there. And they say, well, where is this? She says, and the chief ranger is standing next to the superintendent and says, yeah, that's the same spot 2 days ago. Somebody heard the same thing. We sent, 4 teams of searchers out there, searched for 4 hours, never found anything. Now, 2 days later, they're hearing the same thing, the same location. There have been reports of electronic anomalies in conjunction with these cases. And that could be some of the aircraft crashes. There's also been reports that cars have stalled. Some people have had compasses that just spin endlessly. They don't operate. Yeah, this has happened. Having electronics, this isn't something that would normally be listed in the reports. And it probably should be if there was suspicion. But you got to remember that the search and rescue people that do this, 95% are people like you and me, George, that are volunteering their time to go out and look for people. And when they find somebody, they aren't thinking anomaly. They aren't thinking unusual. They're just thinking this is a normal missing person. If we find them, great. Let's go get them. If they're deceased, it's too bad. There's an area in the middle of the United States that extends down into Texas and goes from North Dakota, South Dakota, straight down through north to south, where there's hardly any disappearances, and it's very, very odd. When you look at the U.S. cluster map, it's unexplainable almost why this one area of the U.S. has almost nothing, and immediately to the right, starting at about the Mississippi and going east, and then starting in probably the Colorado-Kansas border going west. But down through the middle, there's hardly any disappearances. When I wrote my first book, it was a story, and they were hiking down a trail, and I call it Last in Line. And there was a series of disappearances where the person who was last in line disappeared. And it didn't make any sense, except that nobody had eyes on that person last in line.